1415, the Portuguese launched a brutal assault on Ceuta, a thriving Moroccan coastal city and port. But this wasn't just a battle. It was the opening move of a larger imperial plan to depopulate and dominate Morocco's Atlantic coast. With Ceuta's fall, the Marinid dynasty began to crumble, and the Portuguese Empire was born. Ceuta became the first domino, signaling the start of nearly 300 years of conquest. What followed was a calculated wave of conquest disguised as crusade, targeting Morocco's wealthiest cities and turning them into military outposts. City takeovers show each name with dates and transition effects. Khazar es Sagir, 1458-1550, fortified and emptied Asila, 1471-1589, purged for military control. Safi and Azamur ports turned into trade hubs. Mazagao, El Jadida, held for almost 300 years. Tangier passed to the British after nearly 2 centuries. Essaouira, Souira, Guedima, Casablanca, Agadir, all depopulated, militarized, and exploited. These weren't just conquests. They were acts of erasure. Native Moroccan Moors were displaced. Trade and Islamic scholarship were shattered. Fortresses replaced communities, and the Portuguese aimed to weaken Moorish power while seizing control of Atlantic trade. But behind every garrison stood centuries of cultural resistance and the memory of cities that once thrived. Robert J. Miller, an expert in federal Indian law, American Indian Economic Development, International Law, Constitutional Law, and Civil Procedure, explores the legal and historical foundations of colonialism in his work, The International Law of Discovery and Indigenous Peoples. He explains that during the papacy of Urban II, 1088-1099, Portuguese and Spanish crusaders were granted the same papal indulgences traditionally reserved for pilgrimages to Jerusalem, effectively framing colonial conquest as a holy mission sanctioned by the Church. Urban thereafter issued the first call for crusades to the Holy Lands in 1095, and he continued to link crusades with pilgrimages by granting indulgences for crusaders just as he had done for participants in the Holy War with the Moors. The Knights were an infamous crusading priestly order who believed Christians could attack pagans at will and deprive them of their property and lordship. The sources of this power were the papal bulls that had been directed at the Holy Lands. The Knights argued that their territorial and jurisdictional claims could be traced to papal bulls from the crusading era, which had authorized the complete confiscation of the property and sovereignty of non-Christians. Susan Zimmerman, who currently serves as Executive Director of the Secretariat on Responsible Conduct of Research, was among the contributors to Shakespeare Studies Volume 31, bringing her scholarly expertise to the field of early modern literature. The volume was edited by Leeds Barrell, a former professor at the University of South Carolina, and the founding editor of the Journal of Shakespeare Studies. Under his leadership, the journal became a respected platform featuring essays and critical studies by scholars from around the world. Volume 31 states, "The English, lagging behind for about half a century, cashed in on the slave trade as early as the 1480s. Various records kept in several Spanish archives disprove the received view that the English as a slaving nation was late coming in the 1550s. The Moors and Mooresses of Morocco were not only colonial targets of Portuguese and Spanish aggression, but also victims of English exploitation. English merchants purchased captured Moroccan slaves at Andalusian markets, actively participating in the trans-Mediterranean slave trade. This commerce in human lives contributed to the significant depopulation of Morocco's coastal regions. The early involvement of England in this trade has been largely obscured in part due to the silence surrounding such practices in historical accounts, most notably in Gordon Connell Smith's study of the English Andulasia Company, which omits substantial discussion of English slaveholding in Spain. It is time to recognize as a historical fact that the majority of the English merchants resident in Andalusia, such as Robert and Nicholas Thorne, the geographer Roger Barlow, and Thomas Maillard, were slave owners. Some of the merchants trading in Andalusia at that time had places of business both in England and in Spain. The Mallards must be ranked among the leading slave owners in the Iberian Peninsula, considering that the average number of slaves owned by the landed nobility was 15. English trade with Morocco was a natural extension of the existing trade established by the Andalusia Company in Spain and in the Levant. Individual voyages can be traced as far back as the 1520s or 1530s. Professor Robert Allison is actively involved with numerous museums and historical societies in Boston. He has given public lectures at the Bostonian Society and the Adams National Historic Site, and has presented papers at conferences in the United States, Wales, and Turkey. Additionally, he serves as president of the South Boston Historical Society and as vice president of the Colonial Historical Society. Francis, the Howe family endowed chair of Florida Studies at the University of South Florida's St. Petersburg campus, was awarded the Officer's Cross of the Order of Isabella the Catholic during a formal ceremony held at the official residence of Spain's ambassador to the United States in Washington, D.C. Francis published Iberia and the Americas, Culture, Politics, and History, Transatlantic Relations, a 3-volume work in which he writes, "Slavery had long existed in Iberia, but slaves never made up more than a small portion of the population. By 1492, although over 35,000 black slaves had been brought into Portugal, the majority were intended for re-export to other European markets and to the Americas. By 1550, Lisbon had an estimated 9,500 African slaves, referred to in Portuguese records as Mouros Negros or Mouros Pretos, comprising nearly 10% of the city's population. Nationwide, Portugal held approximately 32,370 slaves and 2,580 freedmen, reflecting the scale of African enslavement within the Iberian Peninsula during this period. As Portugal's wars against the Turks and other Muslim powers in the Mediterranean began to decline in the early 1500s, a major shift occurred in the Portuguese slave trade. Enslaved African Moors gradually supplanted earlier enslaved groups, who had included Eastern Europeans like Slavs and Armenians. With Portugal turning its focus to Atlantic trade routes and African coastal raids, enslaved African Moors became the primary labor force in Iberian cities and colonial outposts. In southern Portugal, Moors remained a visible and active part of daily life well into the 16th century. Especially in rural and urban areas of the Algarve and Alentejo regions, large populations of Christianized Moors, known as Moriscos, could be found working the fields or practicing skilled trades as artisans in local towns. Despite conversion, they often lived under close scrutiny and faced systemic discrimination. This image showcases an 18th century Costa painting by an anonymous artist depicting 16 racial classifications used in colonial Spanish America. Painted in oil on canvas, the artwork is preserved at the Museo Nacional del Virreinato in Tepoztlán, Mexico. At its height, Spanish America stretched from California to Argentina, covering most of Central and South America, the Caribbean, and parts of the southern United States. Ruled by the Spanish crown through vast viceroyalties, it became one of history's largest empires, leaving a lasting imprint on the region's language, laws, and culture for over 300 years. The word casta comes from the Iberian languages, Spanish and Portuguese, where it meant lineage or breed as early as the Middle Ages. First recorded in Spanish in 1417, it traces back to the Proto-Indo-European root ger, meaning to bear or to carry. Over time, the Portuguese casta gave rise to the English word caste during the early modern period. Likewise, the Portuguese term Mouros Negros, used to describe enslaved North African Moors, eventually evolved into the English term blackamoor. One illustration from the 1500s shows a black man in chains carrying a heavy bale labeled simply as a Moorish slave. This image reflects the reality of 16th century Iberia, where African Moors made up a growing portion of the enslaved population. In Lisbon alone, by 1550, over 10% of the population was enslaved, many identified in official records as Mouros Negros. Professor Robert Allison is deeply engaged with Boston's historical and cultural institutions. He has delivered public lectures at prominent venues such as the Bostonian Society and the Adams National Historical Park, and has presented scholarly papers at conferences in the United States, Wales, and Turkey. In addition to his academic work, he serves as president of the South Boston Historical Society and as vice president of the Colonial Society of Massachusetts. In his publication, The Barbary Origins of the British Empire, Robert Allison observes, "While European and American literature abounds with narratives of captives held in the Barbary states, there are no first-person accounts from Moors held as captives in Europe. Yet thousands of Moors were indeed taken captive by European powers." According to Matar, the stories of Moorish captives are largely absent from the historical record because few ever returned to their native lands. In Chapter 4, titled Moors in British Captivity, he reconstructs what fragments remain of their experiences. Matar also distinguishes between different forms of captivity in Barbary. A slave, ABD, was someone purchased for permanent servitude, while a captive, Asir, was typically held for ransom. For Matar, however, the central focus of this chapter is the European enslavement of Moors. He emphasizes that European powers made little distinction between different statuses of Moorish captives. Retaliatory raids against Morocco and Algiers, often justified as responses to North African piracy, along with the bombardment of coastal cities, where he argues significant contributors to the economic and political decline of these polities in the 18th century. pp. 131-132. This still is from the 2004 romantic drama film The Merchant of Venice, based on Shakespeare's play of the same name. Gustav Ungerer, a German-born historian, educator, and author, is widely recognized for his contributions to early modern scholarship. In his essay, Portia and the Prince of Morocco, Ungerer explores the racial and cultural dynamics of the play, offering critical insights into the portrayal of Moors in Elizabethan drama. Spanish archival records from cities like Seville and Cadiz reveal that English merchants were actively engaged in the buying and selling of enslaved Moors during the late 15th and early 16th centuries. These records, including shipping logs, notarial entries, and trade manifests, show that England's earliest involvement in slavery occurred not in the Atlantic world, but within the older Iberian slave trade. This system, dominated by Spain and Portugal, trafficked enslaved North Africans and Sub-Saharan Africans across the Iberian Peninsula, the Mediterranean, and early Atlantic colonial outposts, such as the Canary Islands, Madeira, and Cape Verde. By the early 1500s, this trade expanded to include Iberian colonies in the Americas, such as Hispaniola, Cuba, and Brazil, but English merchants first gained experience in human trafficking through their activities in southern Spain. In these markets, they purchased captives referred to as Moros Negros, or Moros Esclavizados. Long before England entered the transatlantic slave trade, it was through the Iberian system that English traders first learned and profited from the brutal economy of slavery. C.L. Sulzberger, an American journalist, diarist, and non-fiction author from the family that owned the New York Times, served as the paper's chief foreign correspondent throughout the 1940s and 1950s. On April 25, 1964, he published an article titled "Foreign Affairs: Our Strongest African Link" in the New York Times, in which he wrote, "Fez, Morocco has a special relationship with the United States that is generally unfamiliar both to Americans and Moroccans. Most Americans are unaware of the special relationship between Morocco and the USA that developed subconsciously through the transatlantic conquests of Moorish-impregnated Spain, and consciously through contacts between our early republic and this old, dilapidated kingdom. Even fewer Americans seem aware of the complex contacts between Morocco at Africa's northwest corner and the ancestors of our Negro community. The truth many don't know: Portugal's invasion of Ceuta in 1415 marked the beginning of European involvement in the African slave trade. Long before the transatlantic trade reached the Americas, African Moors were being enslaved and sold from the coasts of Morocco and beyond. Black Americans, wake up. This history didn't start in 1619. It started with empire conquest and silence. Reclaim your awareness, reclaim the legacy. Before Portugal became an empire, it was Moorish. For centuries, the Moors ruled large parts of the Iberian Peninsula, including what is now Portugal, introducing advanced architecture, science, agriculture, and governance. Cities like Lisbon, then known as Al-Ushbuna, flourished under Moor control. These statues in Silva's Portugal honor Moorish women who once played vital roles in the city's daily life during the Islamic rule of Al-Andalus. They represent a tribute to the cultural and economic contributions of Black and North African Moors in medieval Portuguese society. But by the 13th century, the Moors had lost sovereignty over the region as Christian kingdoms expanded south in what became known as the Reconquista. Yet the story doesn't end there. Less than 2 centuries later, in 1415, the newly formed Portuguese kingdom invaded Morocco. The Moors, once sovereigns of Iberia, were now being conquered, enslaved, and colonized by a power that had risen from lands they once ruled. If you enjoyed this video, type #whitewash in the chat. Please like, share, comment, follow, and subscribe.